Most people wake up already tired, not because their body is weak, but because their mind never truly slept. Before your feet touch the floor, you've already replayed yesterday's mistakes, imagined today's problems, and argued with people who aren't even in the room. It feels normal now. It feels responsible. But the Stoics would have called this a quiet kind of slavery. Marcus Aurelius warned that when the mind is left untrained, it becomes a tyrant, pulling you into worry, fear, and endless inner noise. And here's the part no one tells you. If you can't guide your attention for a few calm seconds, the world will guide your life for years. That's not philosophy for a book. That's a daily reality most people live without realizing they have another option. I've been there too, thinking that if I could just analyze everything enough, I could stay safe, planning every possible outcome, carrying conversations in my head long after they ended. The Stoics saw this pattern centuries ago. Epictetus said we are disturbed not by events, but by the stories we tell ourselves about them. Yet we still live as if our thoughts are facts, as if every worry deserves our loyalty. And slowly, we build a life inside our head while the real one waits outside. If these ideas speak to something real in you, something about wanting a calmer mind, a steadier direction, and a life guided by inner strength instead of constant noise, consider subscribing, not as a favor to me, but as a quiet commitment to your own growth. A small decision to keep choosing clarity, discipline, and meaning in a world that constantly pulls your attention away. Most people think they're exhausted because life is hard. But look closer. You're not tired because the world is heavy. You're tired because your mind never stops talking. Before your day even begins, the noise starts. You replay what you said yesterday. You imagine what could go wrong today. You argue with people who aren't even in the room. By the time your body stands up, your mind is already somewhere else. You wake up carrying a weight that wasn't put on you by life, but by your own thoughts about life. This weight follows you into the shower, into your first sip of coffee, into your first message of the day. It sits quietly in the background, draining you before anything even happens. Over time, you start to believe this heaviness is normal. You start to believe that being tired is part of being responsible, that mental noise is the price of being aware, that constant thinking means you care. But caring and carrying are not the same thing. Caring is presence, carrying is a burden, and most people confuse the two. When was the last time you were actually here? Not here like breathing and blinking, but here in the way a child is here when they're absorbed in a simple moment. Here like your attention wasn't split into pieces. Here like your body and your mind were in the same room. Here, you could taste your coffee, feel your feet on the floor, notice the light in the room without turning it into a story in your head. Most people can't remember the last time they lived a full minute like that. They call their absence normal. They call it being busy. They call it being responsible. The Stoics called it being untrained. They believed the mind, like the body, needs discipline, not harsh discipline. Gentle daily training. Without it, the mind wanders wherever habit pulls it, and habit often pulls it toward worry. Marcus Aurelius wrote that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and that you have the power to revoke at any moment. Think about that for a second. If you can't guide your attention for 10 seconds, how will you guide your direction for 10 years? You say you want peace. You say you want clarity. But peace doesn't come from arranging the world perfectly. Clarity doesn't come from predicting every outcome. Peace comes from mastering the place where the world is experienced. And that place is not outside you, it's inside your head. That's the quiet prison most people live in. The door is open, but they've been pacing the same small room for so long that freedom feels unfamiliar. When you finally step outside, the open space can feel uncomfortable. The silence can feel strange. The absence of constant thinking can feel like something is missing. That missing feeling is just the absence of noise. And noise is what you've been calling life. Your problems may be real, your responsibilities may be heavy, but your suffering is often manufactured in the space between what happens and what your mind says about what happens. Two people can face the same situation. One moves forward, the other collapses. The difference isn't strength or luck. It's the story added to the moment. Epictetus said we are disturbed not by things, but by the views we take of them. The world presents facts. Your mind adds commentary. Someone doesn't reply to your message. The fact is silence. The mind says you're unwanted. You make a small mistake. The fact is an error. The mind says you always fail. Something uncertain appears. The fact is uncertainty. The mind predicts disaster. Over time, you stop seeing facts at all. You only see interpretations, and interpretations multiply. They pile up. They create a version of life that feels heavier than life itself. This is how people become tired of lives they haven't fully lived. Your body is here. Your mind is often somewhere else. Your body feels the chair. Your mind is replaying a conversation from 3 days ago. Your body walks through a door. Your mind is imagining a future that hasn't happened. The present is too quiet for the mind. It has no drama, no storyline, no role to defend. So the mind pulls you away from it. It says, remember that embarrassment. It says, imagine the worst case. It says, what if they judge you? And while you're traveling between memory and imagination, life is happening without you. You call this being busy. But busy isn't the right word. Absent is. Absence from your own life is the deepest kind of fatigue. You can rest your body and still feel tired because the exhaustion isn't physical, it's attentional. The Stoics trained themselves to return to what is, not to escape reality, but to meet it without distortion. They understood that attention is your most valuable currency. Wherever your attention goes, your life goes with it. If your attention lives in fear, your life becomes small. If your attention lives in comparison, your life becomes bitter. If your attention lives in imaginary arguments, your life becomes exhausting. Habit pulls attention the way gravity pulls objects. This is not a moral failure, it's a training issue. Habits are learned, and what is learned can be relearned. When you stop watching where your attention goes, it drifts to familiar patterns. Worry feels familiar. Self-judgment feels familiar. Regret feels familiar. Fantasy feels familiar. Familiar does not mean true, it only means repeated. The mind protects itself by claiming complexity. It whispers that your life is complicated, that your problems are special, that simple practices won't work for you. Complexity makes the mind feel important, but simplicity is where freedom lives. The moment you return to what is simple, the mind loses its grip. Feel your breath, not as a technique, as a sensation. Notice where it touches you, in the nose, in the chest, in the belly. The moment attention rests in sensation, the story loosens. This is not magic, it's how attention works. Attention can only be in one place at a time. When attention is in sensation, it is not in imagination. The doorway out of the head is always here. It's never somewhere else. You don't need to travel to find it. You only need to return. The mind will resist this return. It will say this is boring. It will say you have more important things to think about. It will say this won't fix your life. This resistance isn't logic. It's habit defending itself. Seneca wrote that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. The mind believes that constant thinking is protection. If it analyzes enough, it will prevent pain. If it rehearses enough, it will be ready. But preparation and rumination are not the same thing. Preparation leads to action. Rumination leads to exhaustion. Overthinking feels productive because it looks like effort. But effort without direction is just spinning. The mind can spin for hours and call it work. The body stays still. Life waits. You don't need to fight your thoughts. You don't need to argue with them. You only need to stop feeding them. A fire dies when you stop adding wood. Every time you sit with a thought and replay it, you're adding fuel. Every time you decorate it with extra meaning, you're adding fuel. The thought itself is small. The attention you give it makes it large. When you notice a thought as worry, as judgment, as fear, you create space. That space is not empty, it's clear. In that clarity, you can return to what's real, to breathe, to the body, to the simple action in front of you. This is not suppression, this is a choice. Most people stay in their head because they're avoiding feeling. Thinking becomes a shield. You analyze sadness instead of feeling it. You plan endlessly instead of feeling uncertainty. You judge yourself instead of feeling shame. You scroll instead of feeling loneliness. But emotions don't disappear because you think about them. They stay because you avoid them. Carl Jung wrote that what you resist persists. The mind loops because the body hasn't been allowed to complete what it's holding. When you let yourself feel what's present without turning it into a story, the energy moves, the body softens, the breath deepens, the mind quiets. Not because life changed, but because you stopped running from it. Feeling is not a weakness. Avoiding feeling is what keeps you stuck. Discipline enters quietly, not with force. With consistency, the discipline of attention. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he had power over his own mind, not over events. That reminder didn't change the world. It changed his relationship to the world. When the mind is noisy, the body is an anchor. Stand up, walk, wash your face, write one sentence, do one small action. Action interrupts loops. Most people wait to feel ready. The mind loves waiting because waiting keeps it in charge. Action moves you back into life. You don't act because you're confident. Confidence grows because you act. As you step out of the head, identity loosens. The story you've repeated about yourself begins to fade. I'm behind. I'm not confident. I always fail. These are not facts. They are rehearsed lines. When the story loosens, the ego panics. It feels like losing ground. But you're not losing yourself. You're losing a story that limited you. You are not a story. You are the awareness that notices stories. A story is useful if it helps you move with clarity. If your story makes you smaller, it's not truth. It's training in hesitation. What you rehearse, you become. If you rehearse fear, you become cautious. If you rehearse strength, you become steady. Rehearsal shapes response. Stoic strength is not numbness, it's presence. Not control of life, but control of response. When you stop living in your head, you stop being easy to manipulate. You stop reacting to every hook. You stop chasing approval. You stop explaining yourself to people who don't understand you. You become simpler. Simplicity is powerful because it cannot be twisted easily. A simple mind sees facts. A complicated mind sees threats everywhere. The world hasn't become safer. Your perception has become clearer. Notice how much energy you leak every day. Regrets take it. Comparisons take it. Imaginary arguments take it. Social noise takes it. Then you say you're tired. Of course you are. You've been spilling your attention everywhere. Carry your attention like a full cup. Not rigid, just aware. When you eat, eat. When you walk, walk. When you listen, listen. This is not about perfection. It's about returning. Each return is strength, not failure. The person who returns is stronger than the person who never drifts, because everyone drifts. The difference is who wakes up. Your mind will never be silent forever. Don't chase silence. Chase skill. Skill is the ability to hear the noise and not obey it. Skill is the ability to feel discomfort and still move. Skill is the ability to be uncertain and still choose. This skill grows quietly with practice. Over time, you notice space. You notice calm. You notice that the world didn't change. Your relationship to thought did. You stopped being a prisoner of your own commentary and became a user of your own mind. The moment you stop living in your head, everything changes. Not because life becomes easy, but because you finally meet it directly. Direct life is sharp. It doesn't soften itself to make you comfortable, but it doesn't attack you either. It simply presents what is here, now. When you finally begin to meet life directly, without the thick filter of old fear and future worry, something subtle happens. You stop negotiating with every moment. You stop asking whether you should be feeling what you're feeling. You stop trying to manage your experience before you've even had it. This quiet acceptance is not surrender in the weak sense. It's surrender in the sense of not fighting reality. And when you stop fighting reality, you free up a massive amount of energy that was being wasted on resistance. That energy becomes available for living. There is a strange relief that comes when you realize you don't have to solve your entire life in your head. You don't have to rehearse every conversation. You don't have to predict every outcome. You don't have to carry the future like a burden on your shoulders. Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. Most people live as if that space doesn't exist. They react instantly, automatically, habitually. They call this being honest. But honesty without awareness is just impulse. When you begin to notice that space, even for a moment, you feel a kind of dignity return to you. You realize that you are not just a bundle of reactions. You are someone who can pause, and in that pause, your life changes direction without drama. This pause doesn't feel dramatic. It feels simple. It feels like taking a breath before replying. It feels like letting a thought pass without grabbing it. It feels like allowing a feeling to rise and fall without turning it into a story about who you are. Over time, these small pauses create a different inner environment. The constant urgency softens. The pressure to perform relaxes. You start to sense when thinking is useful and when it is just noise. The mind becomes a tool again, not a place you live. When you need to plan, you plan. When you need to solve, you solve. And when the task is done, you let the tool rest. This is how the Stoics used the mind. They respected it without worshipping it. Most people worship their thoughts without realizing it. They treat every inner voice as if it were wise. But wisdom is not the same as loudness. A thought can shout and still be wrong. A feeling can feel urgent and still pass. The mind is persuasive because it speaks in your own voice. It sounds like you, but it is only one part of you. William James once wrote that the greatest discovery of his generation was that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes of mind. He wasn't talking about forcing positivity. He was pointing to the simple but radical truth that you can notice the tone of your inner world and choose not to follow it blindly. That choice is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes everything. As this choice becomes familiar, you begin to notice how often your suffering came from arguing with what already happened. You replay moments you wish you could change. You imagine different outcomes. You judge yourself for not being who you think you should be by now. This inner argument doesn't rewrite the past. It only steals from the present. The present is where your life actually is. The past exists as memory. The future exists as imagination. Both can be useful when used briefly and intentionally, but living in them drains you. Seneca warned against postponing life, against acting as if you have endless time to live later while missing the time that is happening now. The habit of postponing presence is subtle. You tell yourself you'll feel calm after this problem is solved, after this phase is over, after you reach this goal. Meanwhile, your life keeps passing by in the background. When you begin to return to what is, even in small ways, you might notice discomfort at first. The present doesn't distract you the way thoughts do. It can feel empty if you're used to constant mental noise. It can feel exposed if you're used to hiding in planning. But this exposure is honest. It brings you back into contact with your own life. You begin to sense your body again, the tightness in your shoulders, the shallow breath, the tension you've been carrying without noticing. Your body has been speaking this whole time. You just weren't listening. The mind can pretend, the body cannot. When you listen to the body, you listen to truth without words. As you listen more, your relationship to discomfort changes. You stop seeing discomfort as an enemy to defeat and start seeing it as information. Discomfort tells you when you're tired. It tells you when you've crossed your own limits. It tells you when something matters to you. When you ignore discomfort, it grows louder. When you meet it directly, it often softens. This doesn't mean you seek pain. It means you stop running from normal human feeling. The Stoics didn't teach the removal of emotion. They taught the training of response. They believed you could feel fear without being ruled by it. You could feel sadness without drowning in it. You could feel anger without letting it decide your actions. This distinction between feeling and obeying is where inner freedom lives. As you practice not obeying every inner command, you notice how much of your life was shaped by unconscious habits of thought. The way you talk to yourself becomes more visible. You might notice the harshness. You might notice impatience. You might notice how quickly you assume the worst. This notice is not meant to shame you. It's meant to wake you up. Carl Rogers spoke about the curious paradox that when you accept yourself just as you are, then you can change. Acceptance doesn't mean approval of every habit. It means seeing clearly without turning away. When you see your inner patterns clearly, they begin to loosen. They lose the power that came from being invisible. The loosening of these patterns doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in many small moments of return. Return to breath, return to sensation, return to the simple action in front of you. Return to the fact of what is happening now, not the story about what might happen later. These returns may feel insignificant, but repetition changes the nervous system. Over time, the baseline of your inner world shifts. The noise softens. The space between thoughts widens. You start to notice that you don't have to follow every impulse to speak, to react, to defend, to explain. Silence becomes an option. Not a forced silence, a chosen one. And in that silence, clarity often appears without effort. Clarity does not always feel comfortable. Sometimes clarity shows you habits you've been using to avoid responsibility. Thinking can become a way to delay action. You tell yourself you're preparing. You tell yourself you're waiting for the right moment. You tell yourself you need more information, but underneath there may be fear of being seen trying, fear of failing, fear of discovering your actual level. Thinking feels safe because it keeps you hidden. Action reveals you. Action puts you in contact with reality, with feedback, with growth. This is why the mind resists action. It prefers the safety of rehearsal. But rehearsal without movement is just another form of hiding. When you notice this pattern, you don't need to attack yourself for it. You simply recognize it as another way the mind tries to stay in control. Then you take one small step anyway. Not a dramatic step, a simple one. One message, one paragraph, one honest conversation, one small act of care toward your body. These small acts anchor you back into life. They remind you that you are not here to perfect your thoughts. You are here to live. As living becomes more direct, your relationships change. You stop creating entire stories about people based on small signals. You stop filling silence with assumptions. You begin to respond to what was actually said, not what you imagined was meant. This doesn't make relationships easy. It makes them clearer. Clearer relationships have fewer ghosts in them, fewer imagined enemies, fewer unspoken scripts. When you live in your head, you argue with versions of people that exist only in your imagination. When you return to presence, you meet the person in front of you, not the character your mind created. This clarity extends to the way you treat yourself. Many people speak to themselves in a way they would never speak to someone they care about. The inner voice becomes harsh. demanding, impatient. This voice claims it is motivating you, but harshness rarely produces steady growth. It produces tension. Albert Ellis, one of the founders of modern cognitive therapy, pointed out that much of human distress comes from rigid demands placed on ourselves and others. When you notice the rigidity of your inner rules, you begin to loosen them. You replace condemnation with direction. Instead of saying you're failing, you look at the next small step. Direction grounds you in reality. Condemnation keeps you in the head. As this way of relating to yourself becomes more familiar, you begin to feel a quieter confidence. Not the loud confidence of performance, but the steady confidence of someone who can meet discomfort without collapsing into thought. This confidence doesn't come from convincing yourself you're special. It comes from repeated proof that you can return, that you can pause, that you can act without needing perfect certainty. Over time, you realize that certainty was never the source of your strength. Responsiveness was. The ability to meet what arises and choose your next move without being dragged into endless inner noise. You may notice that your pace changes. You speak slower. You listen more fully. You rush less. This is not because life became slower. It's because you're no longer chasing your own thoughts. Rushing is often the body trying to keep up with a mind that is already somewhere else. When the mind returns to the body moves with ease. Even fast movement can feel calm when attention is present. Calm does not mean slow. Calm means undivided. The more undivided your attention becomes, the more you sense how precious it is. You become selective about where you place it. You notice when social noise drains you. You notice when comparison tightens your chest. You notice when scrolling leaves you empty. This notice is not judgment, it's information. With information, you can choose. You don't need to cut yourself off from the world. You simply need to stop leaking your attention everywhere without choice. Each small choice to return strengthens the habit of presence. Over time, you realize that the mind will continue to offer stories. It will continue to produce worry, plans, judgments, and fears. This doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. The difference is that you no longer take every story as truth. You hear it, you note it, and you decide whether to follow it. This decision point is where freedom lives. Freedom is not the absence of thought, it's the absence of compulsion. It's the ability to hear the inner noise without being owned by it. As this ability grows, your life becomes less dramatic internally, even if externally nothing has changed. The same challenges arise, the same uncertainties appear, the same responsibilities exist, but you are no longer living inside commentary about them. You are meeting them directly. This direct meeting has a quiet power. It doesn't guarantee comfort. It offers honesty, and honesty has a steadiness that comfort cannot replace. Eventually, you begin to sense that the tiredness you once felt so deeply was not a condition of your life, but a condition of your attention. You were tired because you were everywhere except where you were. You were tired because you were living in the echo of your own thoughts. As you return again and again to breath, to body, to simple action, the fatigue softens. Not because life became lighter, but because you stopped carrying the extra weight of constant mental noise. The moment you stop living in your head, everything changes, not in a dramatic, visible way, in a quiet, steady way that reshapes your inner world. You become someone who can meet life as it is without needing to escape into the story. And in that meeting, your life finally becomes something you are actually present for. As you stay with this way of meeting life, you begin to notice that presence doesn't make problems disappear, but it changes how problems land inside you. The weight you used to feel doesn't vanish, yet it no longer crushes you. It sits where it belongs, in the situation itself, not multiplied by layers of fear and imagined outcomes. This is what the Stoics meant by carrying only what is yours to carry. You handle what is in front of you, and you release what exists only in thought. Over time, this creates a quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. You stop proving yourself to your own mind. You simply move. There is a simplicity that emerges in your daily choices. You notice when your attention drifts and you return. You notice when your body is tense and you soften. You notice when your thinking becomes circular and you step back into action. These moments are small, almost invisible to others, but they slowly change the shape of your days. You become less reactive. You become more deliberate. You speak from where you are, not from where your fear projects you to be. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. Precision comes from seeing clearly, and clarity grows when the mind is no longer shouting over every moment. You may find that some people don't understand this shift. They might be used to your old patterns of over-explaining, rushing, or overreacting. When those patterns fade, there can be space where there used to be noise. Some people feel uneasy around that space. That unease is not your responsibility to fix. As you become simpler inside, you become harder to pull into unnecessary drama. This is not withdrawal from life, it is engagement without distortion. You are still here. You are just here without the extra layers of performance. Over time, the habit of returning becomes part of who you are, not as a rigid rule, but as a gentle reflex. You notice the drift. You come back. You notice the tension. You soften. You notice the urge to escape into thought. You return to breath, to body, to the small task in front of you. This repetition rewires how you meet your own mind. It teaches you that you can live with thought without being trapped inside it. The mind becomes a companion rather than a cage. As this companion relationship grows, you begin to sense that the quiet you've been touching is not emptiness. It is space. In that space, you hear yourself more clearly. Not the harsh inner voice, but the simple signals of what matters to you. You start to feel when something is aligned with your values and when it isn't. This clarity doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from listening more deeply to what is already present. When the noise softens, truth doesn't need to shout. Eventually, you realize that returning to presence is not a technique you use to fix your life. It is a way of living your life. You don't wait for the perfect conditions to be present. You practice presence inside imperfect conditions. This is where real steadiness grows, not in the absence of challenge, but in the middle of it. The world continues to move, situations continue to change, people continue to surprise you, and you meet all of it with a mind that knows how to come back to where you are. This return doesn't make life small, it makes it real. If you take one thing with you from this, let it be this. Your life doesn't change when the world finally becomes calm. Your life changes the moment you learn to be calm inside the world as it is. You don't need to win every thought. You don't need to silence your mind forever. You only need to stop letting noise decide who you become. That choice, made quietly and repeated daily, is how a strong life is built. One of the videos on your screen goes deeper into training your attention and building an unshakable Stoic mind. Let it guide you further on this path. Thank you for being a part of Psychresto Mind.